Here we go. There we go. And we hit this button. There we go. All right. Today is a little different. We are now talking to you from Philadelphia and not from 4,000 kilometers away. We came back from Philadelphia on Friday. I mean, got from Costa Rica on Friday, where we have been in the forest for 8 months. So this is like another world. It's definitely another planet. And we were hiding in the forest where there is no COVID virus. And now we're back in the world of COVID virus. So we're going to see how we're going to do. I suspect that a number of you are curious about the exam. And I just realized that for my viewing, the little images on the right-hand side here are hiding it. So I'm going to cut them off for a second. If we had this curve at the end of the semester, from this right about here out to here would be A's. These from about here to there would be B's. These would be C's. And all of these in here really are D's or F's. They don't count. And what I would say to those people who are at that level, you want to think hard about why you're in this course, because I would say that if you're in this little category down here, you probably aren't paying any attention to the course. It doesn't mean enough to you to be interested and involved. For those people of you who are in this category here, the C category, you might want to think hard about why. Why aren't you over here, up here in this, in the 80% category, along with the 80-90% category? Because I really felt that these questions were very easy and straightforward. And so I think you ought to think hard about yourself as to why that's the case, okay? So that's what I would say if we were at the end of the semester. My prediction is that the next mid-quarter exam will look roughly the same, and the final exam will look roughly the same, okay? So these things don't change all that much, but that's where we are at the present time. Now, we're sort of changing gears here, and we move into a mental terrain which is more heavily walked on by Homo sapiens. Now, I mean this in several ways. One is that the stories we're going to be hearing now for at least a couple more have a much more prominent piece of Homo sapiens involved with them than the previous ones. But I should also say that however you want to call it, literally every terrestrial square meter of the planet has already been heavily impacted by Homo sapiens. And I do want to emphasize what we now realize is that Homo sapiens is not really one species. It's a hybrid of at least four different genetic lineages. The Homo sapiens lineage, the Neanderthal lineage, the Denisovian lineage, and another one which we don't yet have a skeleton for. So we are already quite a mixed species at the genomic level. And so that's the animal that's in here doing a lot of the things we're going to be talking about now. Although I'm going to still stay focused on the wild world. Now, I want to explain an underlying theme underneath all these stories that deal with people. As I'm sure is obvious to you by now, while I grew up in the northern United States, I'm very specialized on the tropics. So I'm very sensitive to what's going on in tropical countries. Now, this photograph is not a tropical country. This is your Perelman School of Medicine, right there. The place that I go to get fixed, and probably some of you go to get fixed, is a repair shop. And if you go into this building and you go into the lobby, when you go up the stairs in the center of this building and you get into the lobby, you meet this sign. I'm going to cut myself down on this sign again so I can see all of it myself. Sorry, I've got to figure out how to do this yet. Doesn't seem to want to do it. Okay. Let's see, maybe it's good enough here to say, I want you to read it very carefully. This is from 1897. The director of the Philadelphia Commercial Museum. To our brothers below the Gulf, I would say, send us your minerals, your gums, your resins, your woods, your fibers, your oils, that we may be afforded an opportunity of putting them through our laboratories, discovering their properties, and calling them to the attention of manufacturers, meaning our manufacturers, both by exhibiting them and mentioning their availability for the requirements of their trade. Now, right there in that paragraph, you have a summary statement of human attitude from the north towards the tropics for centuries. In other words, we harvest it from the tropics, we develop it up here, and we don't kick it back to the tropics. This has had a huge impact on everything relating to nature in the tropics. Now, back in the early 70s, I was a very hardcore, in the forest, technically oriented scientist, paying no attention really to people at all. So everything that fascinated me was the little puzzles that humans do, just like that the wild world does, like the acacia ants, and many other things like that. And there was a person who's now deceased, who had written sort of the Bible of tropical forest biology. His name was Paul Richards, and he was from Wales in the UK. And I knew him for a variety of reasons. And I said to him, one day he said to me, Dan, you know, in West Africa, there is an ant plant that has ants, just like the ant acacias do, in the rainforest, and you ought to go and see it, and study it, think about it. Because it had been known for, I don't know, 50 years by that time, or maybe more, but only sort of as a list of things that occur. So I basically got on the plane and went to Nigeria. And it was 1971. And this is the forest that I met. Looked like a perfectly good rainforest. I walked into this forest to do my esoteric science study, not thinking about people or anything related to society at that time. And this is the plant. It says you can think just like the acacia, except this is called Barteria. It's a different group of plants entirely. And these are the ants. You've already seen ants that look like this. These are, in fact, the same subfamily of ants attacking my ballpoint pen when I laid it down on a stump of one of these trees that I had just cut down. The ants were very upset. As you can see, they were busy attacking that pen. Now, the ants live, in this case, inside of hollow stems, just like instead of hollow thorns, they live inside of hollow stems. Here's the hollow stem. There's the ants on the surface. And this is what you see inside. You cut that open. That's where the juveniles of the ants, the pupae and the larvae of the ants are inside that thing. And instead of having belching bodies on the tips of the leaves, in this particular case, the ants, if you like, herd, as H-E-R-D, scale insects on the inner wall. And these insects are puncturing the wall and sucking sap out of the wall of the plant. So that's their food. And then the ants harvest the nectar, which they produce, which is just the sugary sap from the plant, and they harvest the scale insects like you would butcher a cow. So they're getting their protein and their sugars and fats directly from the plant, but through the intermediates of these scale insects instead of producing Belgian bodies, which the plant genome does. This is the ants catching these guys, bringing them in, planting them there like little crops, and harvesting them. And here they are on the outside. There's the entrance hole right there to the hollow stem. And so this is what I was studying. And here's one of them doing exactly what the anacacias do in the New World. Notice it's got a piece of leaf that fell on the Barteria leaf. So the ant goes over to that piece of leaf, picks it up, walks over to the edge, and drops it off. In other words, that same cleaning behavior that you saw with the anacacia is going on here in parallel in West Africa with a completely different species of ant and different species of plant, parallel evolution if there ever was. But it's a mutualism just like the anacacia thing is. Now, there is one difference. As I showed you back here, I had cut down a stump to see what was inside of this tree. The ants were upset. As I cut the stump down, every time I hit the tree with an axe, some of the ants fell off. They landed on me, just like acacia ants do if I'm doing the same thing. I didn't think much about it. They walk around until they find a piece of bear skin, and then they sting. But it doesn't hurt much. I brush it off. The next morning, I could barely move. The sting is a very, very latent acting thing that basically paralyzes the muscles in the vicinity of where you got stung. And I thought a lot about this as opposed to the acacia ants in the New World, who are basically harassing small insects. These guys are evolutionarily set up to deal with big mammals, elephants, and related kinds of things. Now remember, 9,000 years ago, those anacacias were being subject to those same kind of megafauna as well, but they're not anymore. And I don't know how their behavior has changed since then. But these guys are clearly set up physiologically to deal with an animal who's big, needs a lot of pain, and will remember. Okay. So anyway, we're going along, I'm doing all this, looking at this stuff, and there's a river right next to where I'm living. So one day, not thinking about, gee, how many crocodiles are there in an African river? I jumped in the river and went for a long swim. So I'm out in the middle of the river, and out of the water in front of me pops the head of this animal. He came up about a foot away from me in the water and just sat there treading water, looking at me. You can see from the size of the middle-aged lady sitting behind it how big an otter this is. So it sat up there and looked at me, but didn't go away and didn't attack. So my conclusion was that this thing is somehow acclimated to people. I have met pet otters before in Central America. And so I started towards it and it backed away. I went more toward it, it backed away. It turned around and swam away slowly. So I followed it. I go downriver, around the curve, and on the bank of the river is a large white tablecloth spread out. And sitting on the tablecloth is a man in a three-piece black suit and a tie, and a big picnic basket next door, and a lady in crinolines who looked like something out of an 1850s photograph, big bottle of wine, and they were having a picnic on the bank of the river in West Africa. So I swam up to these people, following the otter, who zipped up out of the water, plunked down on the white tablecloth, and sat there looking at me next to the basket of food. I said to this apparition in the forest, what are you? And he says, what are you? And I explained, well, I'm a biologist here in the forest looking at this tree, and I probably launched into a little soliloquy about the ants. And he said, well, you're in my forest. Hello? Well, it turned out, and so he said, I'll send my driver around for you on Monday and take you to what this is all about. So I, okay. So on Monday, a big limousine shows up at the little shack where I was living in the forest with a liveried driver. I get in the back, we drive off through the forest about 50 or 60 miles, and we come out of the forest into an African village. And in the middle of the village is a large green area that looks like central London. Houses like central London and lawns with a high chain link fence around it. The guard opens a gate, we drive in. I'm invited up to a 3-story house that looks straight out of 1850s and go in for tea in the afternoon in my dirty field clothes into this spotless house that looks out of Better Homes and Gardens. And here's the otter sitting in the middle of the living room floor. So we started talking and they started explaining that he is the CEO of the African Timber and Plywood Company, which you're going to meet. And that he owns, or they have the lease for, I think, since they were the colonial owners of Nigeria, basically up till very shortly before this, I think owner is probably a better word. The forest in which I was doing my studies was in fact their forestry plot. So really what we're focusing on today is forestry in a complicated tropical forest in West Africa. So while we're there, the otter goes trundling upstairs, and 15 minutes later or some period of time later, suddenly the lady of the house jumps up, runs upstairs, and I realize that there's water pouring down the stairs from the 2nd floor. And it turns out the otter has learned how to turn on the faucet in the bathtub, gets in the bathtub, turns on the water, but doesn't know how to turn the water off. So the bathtub fills up, the otter gets a great time in the bathtub, and the water just pours down from the 2nd floor to the ground floor living room. So this is the life that's being lived in the middle of this African village, in the middle of an African rainforest. So I'm in this little shack in the forest, obviously a remnant from earlier forestry activities. And on the wall in this forest, in the shack, excuse me, is this broken frame picture, which I took a photograph of. You can see the glass is broken up here at this corner and down at this corner. I kicked myself 100 times in the world for not taking this with me because, of course, this just turned into termite food. And what it is a drawing made by somebody out from the UK. And this would be the new person coming out from the UK. This is the old boy from the UK. And he's the guy in charge of what they're doing in the forest, which I'll show you in a minute. And this is the new boy who probably is going to either be a helper to him or take over his role. And what he's trying to do is learn the names of all the different plants, which is, of course, what this guy is telling him, because the plants, from the standpoint of this operation, are like cattle in a pasture. They are being harvested, otherwise known as tree trunks. So this wood is really, yes, it is a forest, but it's being very carefully managed by the colonial owners who took this thing over in about 1903 or 1904. So the colonial Brit owners set up the African Timber and Plywood Company, which by the time I was there in the 70s was providing, in their words, 2/3 to a half of the wood being used by Europe for furniture. So we're talking about massive volumes of tree trunks, but keeping the forest as a permanent, continuous yield, sustainable yield forest. How are they doing that? That became the question which got me interested as an ecological puzzle. So what I did was, instead of saying, well, thank you very much, and having my tea and cookies and going away, I asked if I could participate and learn about all of this. So I spent several days going along with them, trying to understand the whole process. Because I had grown up in the Neurotropics, where the way you harvest the forest is like going into a pasture full of cows, shooting all the cows, saving what piece of the meat you can, and walking away. Whereas this forest had been set up to yield continually. So here's one of the trees. So that tree is probably about 75 to 100 years old, something like that. As you can see from the sledgehammer at the bottom, it's a very large tree. It's just been slaughtered, chainsaw and axes. This is it laying on the ground. As you can see, it is a very large tree. It has fallen not the way a tree dies in the forest. The way a tree dies in the forest is to gradually decompose. Branch falls off here, another branch falls off there, the crown finally gets smaller, and eventually the other trees close in, and maybe there was a lucky seedling right in that hole that grows up and refill the slot. In this case, the tree is dropping. This is a 50-meter tall tree, and it's dropping in a big crash, and the whole crown makes a big hole in the forest floor, kills a lot of seedlings, a lot of saplings, and lets a lot of light in. So that's the first step. You kill the big cow. Now, how do they decide which cow to kill? The forest is divided into blocks that are quite large, 5 hectares in size, and each of the 5 hectares in the block, you start out and you take the first hectare and you map all trees in that area big enough to harvest. So that might be 20 trees. And this list then goes to a central office. The central office looks down them and looks at their diameters, looks at which species they are. So you identify them all while they're still standing. And then it says, all right, tree number 21, tree number 16, tree number 13, tree number 9, you must harvest and you will be charged for them. If you don't harvest them, you're still going to be charged for them. So the commercial company, of course, takes those trees. But when you drop that tree, if you damage any of the other harvestable trees, you're going to be fined the value of that other tree for having done that damage. So the commercial company is very careful. And I was really blown away to watch these guys drop a tree like this, which weighs 20 or 30 tons, on a post or a stick that's stuck in the ground 50 meters away. I mean, they were really good at knowing exactly how the tree was going to fall. So they dropped them. This is where the crown hit. There's a big mess of broken branches and all this kind of stuff. So now we have a kind of different thing than a natural tree fall. We have a few holes that are big in this thing, but the rest of the canopy in this place is left intact. So next is, you see that it's very hard. This is a very poor photograph. I apologize. Same photograph on both sides here. This is the one I have, and this is a lightened up one over here. So here's the road running through here. This tree right here is a big valuable tree, but it's left in place. And you see the cables on it here? Those cables are used as pulleys on those cables are used to drag the tree trunk out of the forest. So it's dragged very carefully. It isn't a bulldozer who goes into the forest, makes a road to the corpse, and pulls it out with the bulldozer, which is how you do it in the New World tropics. What these guys were doing was by hand labor and by using a system of pulleys like this, dragging the tree trunks out of the forest to minimize the damage. So they finally ended up with a bunch of tree trunks lying out here in this little open area. And notice that the trees have all lost their bark. As I said, they're skinned. Now, tropical trees, the center of a tropical tree, all of this you already know is dead. This has been filled with nasty chemicals to keep from being decomposed by termites and ants and things, wood-boring insects. But the living part is out here. And the especially living part is right underneath the bark, the cambium. So what these guys have done with machetes, and they're just starting on this log over here, as you can see, is gone through and basically skinned off the outer bark, which is the living piece, which provides food for wood-boring beetles. So that the wood-boring beetles don't have a place that they can lay their eggs, and the larvae then can drill into the wood and damage the wood. So this is the first step in protecting. So this is like putting a butchered cow in a cooler or a freezer to keep it from spoiling in effect, all right? Then those logs go on a truck in a single lane road. So the single lane road, and notice right here, a nice big harvestable tree, and another big harvestable tree, another one over here, all right next to the road. If this was the new Neotropics, those wouldn't be there anymore, because the first thing they do when they put the road in is take the trees out. These guys are putting the road in to where those trees have been harvested very carefully and pooled in one place, and then they're trucked out one or two at a time. 1 to 2 years later, that road is abandoned. Nobody's using it. No colonists are allowed to move in. If this was Brazil or Colombia or Venezuela or Mexico or Costa Rica, this road now, the first road put in as the logging road would now be basically a farming road with houses and farms branched off of it, i.e. it gives farmers access to the forest. This is controlled so that once they abandon their road, it's now allowed to restore and gradually fill in. And that's what these plants are here. These are the very fast growing, quick growing. These are all macarangas, which have bird dispersed seeds. Small birds would have carried the seeds in there. And there will be some seedlings mixed in with them of the bigger, more valuable trees. But most of the vegetation will be these. So the second year, people come in by hand and cut and clear these fast-growing secondary successional species which have no market value. But they're very careful not to cut the seedlings of the big trees, which will then grow up to be valuable trees 30, 40, 50, 100 years from now. So this method of handling the forest is very careful tree farming, really. It's not called that. It's called Taungaya, which is an African word. Then I'll explain where that comes from in a moment. And but the point is that it's done this way as developing it for sustained yield over time. Why? Because the UK colonial Brits taking over this Nigerian rainforest did not see it as a place to be colonized by hundreds of other, or thousands of other people. They saw it as a place, as a harvestable place, like you would treat your own garden behind your own house. Now, 30 years later, that logging road looks like this. Now this, I mean, I wasn't there 30 years ago, of course, but the reason why I know it's 30 years old, or approximately, is because right behind this tree was my first exposure to this, and I didn't understand anything about this at the time. I'm working down this trail, and right behind this tree is a cement square block embedded in the ground. And in it is scratched the date. I've forgotten what the date was at that time. I was there in 70, so it'd be about World War II, for 1940, something like that. And I couldn't figure out why in the middle of this beautiful rainforest was a cement block stuck in the ground with 1940 engraved in the top of it. Well, it turns out that that was a corner post for one of these areas that was being harvested. So this was a logging site 30 years earlier. And completely fooled me as a very experienced tropical rainforest biologist. Never occurred to me that this place had been perturbed by anybody. It gives you an idea how well this kind of methodology works. So now what happens? The truck goes off with that log on the back, and he goes through a series of winding little narrow one-lane roads. And they get to a point about here and unload the logs. Another truck comes from over here, from another one of these 5-hectare squares. Oh, I just told you wrong. It's not 5 hectares, it's 5 square kilometers. It's not 5 square. These people have 400 square kilometers in their lease. It's 5 square kilometers, not hectares, sorry. And the logs are coming now from different blocks like this in different places and being piled right here. Oh, I didn't show you one thing. I'll have to go back here. Yes, you see on the end of each of these logs, this stuff right here, that's a code, an individual code that each log receives. So that code relates to the map that they made originally. So that tree is a numbered tree. It's like a cow with a tag in its ear. Okay. So now these logs are arriving in here. They're all registered with their names, where they came from. As they pile up here, they reaches a point where they've got, let's say, 8 logs of one species. All 8 logs are taken out here, and you see that first log right there? Another one will be next to it, another put next to it, and they end up with about, say, 6 or 8 logs across this way. Notice that underneath it is another 6 or 8 logs. In fact, it makes layers like a sandwich. So this stack right here might be 6 logs deep. So this deep log pile is then floated downriver. And they know what species are in what layers. And here we get down to the log pond where these things are stored. Now, these logs here will have other logs underneath them. So this is a deep stack of logs. Now, what's the advantage of that? Why aren't they just floating on the surface? Because all the logs below are underwater and they can't be then attacked by insects. So it's in effect like a deep freeze for the meat you're taking off of these cows, which you're harvesting out of the forest. So here's another one of those log piles. There's another one here. There's another one here. Another, like these sandwiches floating in the river. One over here. They know where they all are. This is a particularly valuable log. It's a very large log, but it's very, very dense. Remember I told you that persimmon trees core are black and they're the piano keys? Well, this is a persimmon log and it's so dense that it sinks. It doesn't float. So what they do is, as you can see here, they've got barbed wire hanging down and running underneath the log and suspended from these 2 things across here. So these 2 are basically the life vest for this very valuable log, which is underwater. So now when they get ready to do a mill run of a particular species, they know where they all are. So these guys go out there and they locate the proper lump, and then he marks this set, and that little boat goes out here and grabs a hold of the end of the log and takes them in, and then brings them up a canal, and they come in a canal, and this is the canal right here. It's just, you can't see the water in it, but it's here. These things floated in and are lifted out one at a time for the meal, and then cut to the exact length that you want them to be cut to. And the saws, or the knives, if you like, are adjusted to the particular density and kind of wood of that species. So all day long, the mill will just do one species of tree. So very efficient, and they set their saws that way, they're sharpening of them, they're knowing what kind of cuts they're gonna make, because they already know what the wood is supposed to look like from this log before it ever lands in that little trough right here to start cutting it up. So what we're saying is it's a very specialized processing that's going on in total contrast to what would be going on in the New World tropics. So now here they come out of the saw, and here, now there's 2 things in this photograph. What is these things right here? You see how they're cut in a quarter, what's called a quarter round? That's a special shape, so that when you want to make plywood, you put this in a big, like a big shaving knife, and it slices off a thin surface as it goes around and around and around. And this gives you a very pretty pattern for your boardroom walls and for the boardroom table and other kinds of interior decoration where the color pattern and the wood grain matters, all right? Then this is more ordinary timber that you see over here. And then this is what's called roundwood. Now this was 1971. So they were still exporting roundwood at that time. So this means you could be in Denmark or China or in, you name it, Japan or Georgia, the United States, and order a particular species of tree, a particular wood characteristic from Africa, and you could buy the whole log. So you get all of it, the sawdust, the little chips, the different kinds of cuts, and you process that in your own home country, so you're making the money from doing the processing. So you're basically buying, it's like buying a whole cow off a boat. You're buying roundwood. This is no longer legal because these countries finally realized that, wait a minute, why are we exporting the labor? Why don't we insist on? So the legislation, I don't know about Nigeria specifically, but most of these countries now have laws that say things like you can't export the wood until it's been sawn at least 3 different times, meaning it's been cut into different things, so you're selling the particular cuts. And we go back to the stack of more ordinary looking lumber. Here are the 2x4s or the 4x8s or whatever they happen to be in size. And because of this registration here on this stack card, they can go back and tell you from exactly what tree that particular individual 2x8 or whatever it is came from in detail. All this was done on 3x5 cards, like in a big library where you have huge stacks with many, tens of thousands of books and all 3x5 cards. And you did it. This is all before computers now. And so you looked all this up on 3x5 cards, and they spent your life like little secretaries, and they're handling all this paperwork to know what was going where. So everything was understood and on its way before it ever really hit that sawmill. Now, I looked at this and I talked to the guys working in the sawmill, and I discovered several things. One is the UK people, the Brits, when they colonized Nigeria, and they ran into systems like this, which were very stable before they got there. I'll show you more of that in a few seconds. Were very clever as colonists. They did not do as Spain and Portugal did, which is basically move in and wipe out societies in the New World tropics, the indigenous societies. What they did here was they went in and they took out the top layer, the royalty, the wealthy, the very top, effectively the owners, the 1%, and replaced them with British civil servants and left all the rest intact. So I'm sitting here talking to these guys, trying to figure out how it is that these working guys, just like the Latin American working guys that I've spent my life with, these guys were far more disciplined than would have been the equivalent social and economic structure in Costa Rica or Mexico or Guatemala or Chile or Colombia, the places that I was familiar with. And they kind of looked at me like I was crazy, like, well, why not? Because basically, as you'll see in a moment, they have grown up in a culture where very strong social control at the village level is an intact part of the culture. That's what they grew up with as children. That's what was their world. So when they build a sawmill like this and everything has to be done exactly this way, that seems perfectly natural. And the striking thing about this is the men's room right here. And this sign, which you probably can't read, says disciplinary action will be taken against any persons idle, sitting, and then down here it said gossiping, you can't read it anymore, in the latrine. Now in Latin America, that sign would have lasted about 10 minutes. In other words, the rebellion reaction would have been immediate. And this kind of thing, this disciplinary action will be taken, would not ever have been tolerated. And we're not talking about the senior UK guy now. We're talking about by the culture that the line managers, the regular people, the guys, the heads of the work crews themselves, all of them. So now we go to the village. This is the village next door to which my little shack in the forest was living. The first thing I want you to notice is that behind the village, right here, is primary rainforest. 20 meters from these buildings. As I get to talking to people and sitting around and chatting with them and all that, I suddenly realized this village has been here for hundreds of years. And 10 meters away is primary forest, untouched. And not by any laws in the country. This had me very puzzled. But there's several other puzzling things in this photograph. You see no livestock, no chickens, no goats, no pigs, no cows, no horses, nothing. Notice that the houses are roughly in rows. And this hedge is roughly in rows. So I'm sitting there shuffling through the rubbish in this shack that I'm living in, and I find a book, not a book, a portion of a notebook, which I desperately wish I had kept, which was the minutes of the council meeting of this town. Now, why it was in the shack, I have no idea. Partly torn up, partly eaten by termites, but there was enough there for me to read. And what I read and was fascinated by was 3 or 4 pages dealing with a young couple, 18 and 19 years old, who had gotten married from one of these village houses and wanted to build their own additional house. The village council debated for several days, and the answer was no. You leave the village or you move in with my parents. We have, I forgot what it was, 18 or some number of houses like that, and they are it. This house does not grow bigger. Second, there was another page for some guy who lived at the last of the house in one of the last houses in this row, who wanted the piece of his house had begun to fall down, and he needed a big, like a 4x4 support of timber to prop up the end of his house. And the discussion was, could he go into the forest and cut one tree to get a trunk of 4x4, 6x6, whatever it was, of wood that he could use to prop his house up? And the answer after debate was no. You either buy it from I don't know where, or you don't do it. That simple. Now this was not, I'm saying this is not the colonial owners, this was not the colonial owner leaders, this was not national legislation. So here we are. I mean, I'm the village is right behind me as I took this photograph. These are people coming out of the forest. There it is, right there. And this is these trees that you see down here are the start of this year's garden in the forest. It's what it looks like from the year before. This is about 3 hectares, 4 hectares of an abandoned field, and had about 30 species of plants growing in it. Tubers, stems, fruits, nuts, all kinds of stuff. All planted by hand, all harvested by hand, and right next door, the intact forest. As you can see, the intact forest is right here. This was cut, and you can see it's a chaotic cutting, right? Here's stumps, logs laying on the side, all that kind of stuff. Planted, taken care of for a year, harvested, and walked away. And next year, there was big discussion as to where the next one should be. And it turned out to be about 10 kilometers, I forgot, 8 kilometers, something, a long walk from the village. So everybody went to that place. They cut it all down. They planted all their plants. How they decided who owned what, I have no idea. And they did that for a year. And they walked away. Now, the striking thing to me was, of course, that this was a Latin American old field, which you would call slash and burn. It would now, after this first year or second year, be full of livestock. This is where you put your cows. This is where you put your horses, your mules, your pigs, your goats. This is the kind of a field in which the goat herd took the goats through. They got me included in the Anacacias back in Veracruz. No way. That was prohibited by the village culture. We're going to get a little more of that in a minute here. You could not put your livestock in it, and you could not farm this field for more than 1 year. Now, the Brits came in and they saw this system, it's called the one called Tangaya, and they realized that you could sort of incorporate this in their logging interests. So what they did was, the village statement was, you can go ahead and continue this kind of farming and the primary forest and all that kind of stuff, as you've been doing for God knows how many years or centuries. But if you clear weeds, you can't kill the seedlings of the valuable species of trees. which these guys all knew what they were because they were the ones working in the forestry plants. So what is valuable of all these trees was a new piece of information added to the system. So when they saw a seedling that went with, let's just pretend for the moment that this
Dan, can you repeat the last part again? It was breaking so much.
Okay, hold on a minute here. I can't get my my pointer back either.
Mm-hmm.
Something's going on. Ah, there we go. Okay, the last part being here that if you're going to weed any of this field to favor your crop plants, you can't weed out the juveniles of the valuable trees from a timber standpoint. How do they know which was a value timber to the European furniture industry? Because that's the piece of information that the British UK put into the system. Because the men of this village were the employees of the forestry clearing operation. I mean, the forestry logging operation. So that was where they worked, as in working. Okay? And they got their salaries from that. So they already knew which were valuable trees because they were dealing with about 70 species of valuable trees in this forest. The New World tropics would have simply cut it all down and marketed the few species that were of very high value at that time. Mahoganies, lawn furniture for Florida, things of that nature. The ebonies for piano keys, those things, and ignored the rest. Okay. So that's basically, it's all like I say, this great big tall tree sitting right here, the seedlings of that would have been recognized by the people in this village who were farming this kind of slash and burn. This is the kind of slash and burn that indigenous people have been doing for millennia and millennia and millennia in tropical forests. There's no surprise there. It's the Europeans who moved in and instituted a different way, which is to clear the forest of valuable stuff, turn your livestock loose on it, and move to another piece of forest. That is what eats rainforest. That is what gives you the fires in Brazil. And where do the cows go from the pastures in the fires in Brazil? The United States, Europe, and China. Where does the soybeans go that come from clearing that forest to grow soybeans year after year after year? To China and Europe and the United States. They're not eaten by Brazil, not eaten by Colombia, not eaten by Mexico. Now, right next door, like 50 meters away, is this river. This is the river I went swimming in. As you can see, it's not muddy, it's not dirty, and more than that, the forest comes right down to the edge. If this was a Latin American river, people around like this, there'd be no forest anywhere near. There might be a few shrubs, a few trees nearby, but basically you would see muddy banks that have been used very heavily for washing laundry and for getting livestock, food for livestock, and for other kinds of irrigation and other kinds of uses. This river was untouched. So it looks like close up. It was so untouched that I stupidly never even thought about the crocodiles. It turned out that didn't matter because there weren't any crocodiles, and I'll explain why there weren't any here in a minute. But the point is that this river, right next to human, 30, 40, 50 families, turned out the first thing is the water from the river was all carried from the river in containers to the village and used in the village. Nobody put their laundry, nobody washed their laundry in the river. So this was my informant. This is my next door neighbor. He's about 80 years old or 80 plus. He wasn't certain himself. He's stone blind from cataracts. And he is making a fish trap with his hands. That's what he's making here. And so that was my curiosity at the beginning. I asked him what he was doing, and he explained that he was making a fish trap. And I looked at the fish trap and I thought, Then he explained to me it was for very small fish, which you would call minnows, very, very little fish. So we got to talking about why the river only had very little fish. And he said, oh, in World War II, we got hand grenades. That's it. I didn't need any more explanation. You want the fish in a river, you just pull the pin on a hand grenade and drop it in the water. When it blows up, the concussion knocks out everybody as any size at all. They come floating up to the surface and you harvest them. It takes the crocodiles also. So what happened was, just following his words, that when we got explosives, basically we cleaned the fish out of the river. Why? Because there were no local regulations, no local traditions against it. There weren't anything. There were against cutting the trees. There were against contaminating the water, but there weren't any rules against blowing up the river. So that's what they did. You will meet this story again later in another place. Now, in this forest, as I was doing my biology, I kept running into these snares. This is a piece of piano wire. You can see it right here. Excuse me. Well, we call it piano wire. It's the very strong wire used to hang a big picture frame on a wall. And this is a very clever little trap that's probably been around for, I don't know, 1 million years or more. This right here is a wire coming down. See, it's coming down. It's coming down from a bent over tree sapling. So that's like a spring. And it's pulling in that direction right from here. This thing right here is blocking the wire from going that direction because the tip of the stick is stuck against this little edge down here. So if the animal comes through and puts his head through here and steps on this piece, pushes this down, that trips this loose. And with that loose, this stick here goes that way and pulls the noose tight around the neck of the animal. This forest had no small mammals. I'm used to New World forests, and they're full of small mammals. None. Absolutely empty. Well, I asked him, tell me more. I explained to him because I saw a couple of these that I didn't register what they were. I really learned about this stuff later, some 6 years later, in a different country in Africa. But this was the first time I'd encountered these things. You see, that would be made out of leather or out of vines 1 million years ago. The other rest of it is all right there. It's just completely natural material. So the animals have no escape. If you're a small animal, you can stick your head through, there's no refuge. So the more of these there are in the forest, the fewer animals there's going to be. And the more this wire lasts forever, the fewer animals there are going to be. So when you Europeans add wire, it changes the whole dynamic of harvesting what's called bushmeat. Okay. Now this was another house next door to mine. And I was shown with great secrecy after being there for about a week, this one chicken. This was contraband. This was illegal. You were not allowed to have livestock. How many people knew about it and how many just looked the other way because the person was important or needed the eggs or whatever the reasons, I have no idea. But I was taken and shown the one chicken. That's why I have one photograph of this chicken. This is the contraband tomato plant. Notice that one has died or dying, and this one over here look like they're probably still healthy. These are also contraband, and I was sworn to secrecy that I would not talk about these, and I was only allowed to take one photograph, like I was allowed to take one photograph of the chicken. This is the entire protein that I detected that the village got in my entire, I think, 13 days there. That's a giant African land snail. You see the hole cut in it right there? Now, these have been introduced to Florida, and they're a major pest, but they're native to Africa. And a hole has been cut in it here to break the animal free inside to get the snail out. That is the only bushmeat that I saw these people get. I never saw anybody catch one with a snare. Okay. But when they talk about bushmeat, we're talking about people who are down to the level of anything. A snake, a lizard, a mouse, a baby bird, it doesn't matter what it is fair game. This is street side in East Guinea. So people talk about, did COVID come from pangolins? And oh, woe is us. We shouldn't be eating animals out of the forest, because now we're very close to the forest. Humans have been catching bushmeat for millions of years, immersed in their blood, eating them all the time. Nothing new going on. What's new is that one of the viruses has jumped to humans, but it's not because they're eating bushmeat. This is the pangolin right there. This is a porcupine, a porcupine, a porcupine. This is the hind leg of a duiker, it's like a deer. This is the hind leg of a duiker, it's like a deer. This is a civet, a cat-like animal. These are two cat-like animals. I think they're a different species of civet, but the heads are hidden, so I'm not absolutely certain. This is for sale on the roadside. This is a recent photograph. This is not 1971. We have been doing this forever, and we will continue doing it forever. You don't expect this guy to sit there and starve himself for protein when these animals are still sitting right there behind his house. Now, this is the New World logging operation. First thing you do is you go to a bulldozer, cut a big wide road, wide enough so the two trucks can pass, wide enough so that future colonists will use this road to move in, and this becomes their access road to build farms into that rainforest. In other words, instead of moving in and clearing one area that you walk to for 3 kilometers or 5 kilometers or 10 kilometers, different place each year, what you do is you move in and you relieve the slum pressure in the slums of a big city, and politician does, by offering transport to the slum dwellers to have their own house, their own family, their own little farm out there in the rainforest. And the access points are these logging roads that go in to cream off the valuable trees. So they go in and cream off the valuable, they build bridges over the rivers out of the logs that they're cutting down. And so this is how it starts. So this is what it begins to look like in the beginning. And these are the logs that have recently been cut. You notice that there's no barking, no bark has been peeled off the outside. These things are going to be put on a truck and whipped into a sawmill, cut up fast and sold. Gone. There's no, because the only ones that are being taken out are the valuable ones, the ones that are market valuable now. So for example, if this was a Cortez Amarillo, which is probably 90% of the lawn furniture in Florida is made out of Cortez Amarillo. It comes out of forests in Venezuela, Colombia, Mexico, Costa Rica, so on, because it's a wood that's extremely resistant to UV sunlight, rainfall, and termites and insects. And so, I mean, other insects. So that what happens is, and fungi. So what happens is that all the Cortez Amarillo logs got creamed off immediately. They go right on the truck, they go right to San Jose, they go right into the sawmill, and they're taken out as 4x4s or 2x4s or whatever it is that's on demand, and they're gone. So this is how it starts, okay? And it just gets bigger and wider as it goes on. There's no merchantable trees in this photograph at all. This is a mixture of juveniles of all sorts, and nobody's gonna come in here and clean this up and let it go back to forest. It's gonna get paved or gravel or otherwise closed down, because the loggers have no interest in owning the forest or controlling the forest. They simply wanted to get in, get the valuable pieces, and be gone. Okay. And so the equipment that they're using, I should add, tends to be at the very bottom end of the economic scale. trucks that break down very frequently, trucks that are very full. You end up with trucks that end up looking like this. These logs will be guaranteed to be ones that are of high value. Now, if you're a colonist of your own, you moved into rainforest and you cleared with your axe and your chainsaw enough of a field to get your first crop off, to turn it into a beginning pasture, to turn it into a beginning rice field, whatever it is. If you've done that in Latin America, first off, you are perforce the owner of that land. The act of clearing it makes you the owner. So that's the sort of start off with the huge difference, of course, because the village did not, the Nigerian village we were looking at did not own the forest in the sense that they could sell it. Now, what the ownership was before it became a British colony, I don't know. What I suspect is it was basically territoriality, is that this village had access to this large area in which to have their shifting field. And those villages may or may not have been demarcated as having their own area to do their thing in by the British colonial owners, and after the country gained its independence. That part I don't know. But what happens here is that the land is basically viewed as not having an owner until you move in and you put your labor into clearing it, and then it is yours. Now, at that point, several things happen. One is, if you're an outsider and you want to own a big chunk of this forest, what you do is you subsidize a large number of colonists to clear forest. And then they sell their little plot of land to you. So you get their labor in clearing it. When you've cleared it, the value of that terrain has gone up by threefold, fivefold, tenfold, because the forest is viewed as having no value at all. So at the time you clear it, at that time, usually what happens, if you're a real colonial colonist, you just burn the logs. You don't even try to get them out because it won't be a road to get you out. You went in there with a mule and your young wife and 2 kids, and you set up frontier farming. And so there's not even a way to get the logs out of there. But if you're near a road, or there's some way that you do have a friend with a truck or whatever it is, then you will sell the valuable logs. So gradually then the forest becomes eaten bigger and bigger and bigger. The pastures expand more and more and more. And one last dynamic to mention in this is, when you move into that forest and you're going to clear it, you don't just start out with a machete and a chainsaw and just take every single plant. What you do is you cut down the understory, leaving the trees. Let the understory lay there on the ground, dry out, partly rot. The next dry season, you put a match to it. That burns out the underside. The word for Spanish for that is socolado. And if you socolado a piece of forest, then it increases its value substantially. And then what you do is, from the air, it looks just like the same piece of forest, but there's nothing underneath it. Then you burn it. When you burn it, you kill some of the bigger trees from the heat. Sunlight gets in. The sunlight grows the grasses. So now you get grasses growing underneath the forest canopy. You burn it again the next year. And you get all these photographs that you've been seeing in The Guardian, New York Times, and all the other sources of news about how they're burning the rainforest in Brazil. They're not burning the rainforest. They're burning what's left of the rainforest after they've already cleared and socolated that forest. And then what you do is you turn livestock loose on that grass. And the livestock then are your crop, in effect. Okay. This is what I meant by logging trucks, which are poorly loaded, poorly taken care of. This is right near our house in Costa Rica. And the sloppiness that was related to this, or the poor truck maintenance that was related to this, there is a blown out tire right here, but that may not have been the cause. I don't know whether that was the cause or not. But this is the kind of thing which I never saw in Africa, but it's very frequently on the Costa Rican highways. Now, at the end of the logging truck in Latin America, very commonly you see these little tags. The little tags are issued by the forestry department, saying that this is a legal tree to have cut. Now, what's a legal tree? Well, if it's primary forest or intact forest, you're not allowed to cut it. The law says that that changes the use of that land. So the forest becomes worthless to you unless you have tourists who are coming and admiring it, and then they pay you something for admiring it, bird watching or staying there for picnics or whatever it happens to be. But basically, what you really want to do is convert your forest into pasture or fields. How are you going to do that? Well, one way you can do it is you can soak a lot of it so you're not cutting down any trees. You're getting all the underneath stuff underneath. And then we get into the question of what is a forest? Well, it turns out in Costa Rica, you have to have more than 60 trees in a hectare that are more than 15 centimeters in diameter. In other words, there's a legal definition of the forest. So if you go in and you kill one tree here and you kill one tree there, pretty soon you don't have enough trees in your forest for it to be legally a forest. So now you can apply for a permit to cut the trees in your field because it's not a forest anymore, is it? So now it's a field. So now you can go in and cut these individual trees with a permit to cut trees in a field or pasture. Now, when you do that, you get the little tags, which state what species it was. So it's not a prohibited species. Now, it just so happens this truck is covered with mahogany logs. And mahogany in Costa Rica is against the law to cut, whether it's a seedling or a great huge tree like this particular one. So how did I get a photograph of a logging truck with cutting permits, whether they're from a forest or from a field, for mahogany logs stuck on the back end? What you do is you get the permit for another species of tree. And then you take the little tag off the log for the other species of tree, and you tack it on the end of your mahogany log. And you drive like crazy down the highway to the sawmill. And in the sawmill, you quickly cut it up. So I can go into the sawmill and buy beautiful mahogany boards from absolutely prohibited to cut trees. So that's the kind of wildcat commercial operation that goes on continually in the New World tropics. And there's many more, shall we say, aspects or mutations of that system, where now we're dealing with a commercial product harvested by many different people under many different circumstances, and as opposed to very organized harvesting in things like where the African Plywood and African Timber and Plywood Company was doing its operation. Now, the Timber and Plywood Company today, now 2020, you go over there to the same forest that I was in and that they were doing the logging in, it's no longer there. It's not there. Well, what happened to it? It's all old miserable fields in secondary succession. Because when Nigeria became independent from Britain, it had to be a country. And if you're a country, you have to have an army. And armies are very expensive. And then a small successionist portion of Nigeria called Biafra in the middle 60s decided to be independent from from Nigeria, sorry, from Nigeria. So it started a civil war for its own independence from Nigeria. So Nigeria had to have a lot of forest to sell a lot of wood in a hurry to China and other such places, and use the money to buy weapons, which came from France, came from Europe, other countries in Europe. Biafra had to do the same thing because they needed an army to do their own secession from Nigeria. So they cut their forest, and this particular forest went that way. So it's not there anymore. It was established in 1903. In other words, there are ways. I'm not saying they're socially good or bad. But there are ways to manage and harvest a high quality tropical rainforest without destroying it and into perpetuity, which will be told to you as absolutely impossible if you get to talking to any New World foresters about harvesting tropical forest. They'll all tell you that there is no way. So I say, well, I'd like to get my slides out and show you another way. No, we don't want to know. Because it's anathema to the whole cultural system. And that's where we are, is that there's a technical ability, but there is not a social, cultural ability and willingness to do it, to harvest a complex, because you could do the same thing in the New World tropical forest just as well. And it's very striking how you go over there and you talk to people in the European wood industry, and they'll tell you, oh yeah, we get the necks for violins from such and such a place, from such and such a species of tree. Dan, do you happen to know where there's a lot of this species of tree growing? In other words, or turned around the other way, what has been suggested for the New World tropics is this: you're a colonial farmer and you have a piece of forest. You can be taught how to know the species of trees in your forest. And you can be taught to know which ones have high and low market value. You can go out and measure your own trees, the diameter, the length of the bowl, all that kind of stuff. You could put that up on the web for auction. And a Copenhagen furniture company could look at that thing on the web and say, oh, that tree trunk there in that country is exactly the wood I need to do the things I want to do. So I will pay you the transport cost for that whole log, harvested and cut in such and such a way. And you cut all the middlemen out. So the middleman is the boat that takes it to Copenhagen, the truck that gets you to the wharf where you load it on the boat. What else? But that kind of deliberate market is not liked by anybody because all the other anybody's in between are not getting their cut. Okay. So that's where we are when people talk about, can you harvest or deal with tropical complicated forest for timber? Okay. We'll go at this in a different way in a later lecture. So I think we've hit the end of our time here. So I think it's time to close down. So there we go. And there we go. And it's very interesting to me sitting here in the kitchen. I can say one last thing before I close off. I just realized there's a lot of mosquitoes where we are in Costa Rica, and they have very distinctive behaviors while they come into the light on my laptop and under the attractiveness of biting me. And we have mosquitoes that come in through our back door here in Philadelphia. And I can tell you that the behavior of a mosquito looking for me in Philadelphia is very different from the behavior of a mosquito looking for me in Costa Rica. They fly differently, they react differently to being slapped in the air. They're different in my ability to kill them flying up to me. And they're really quite a different animal, even though they're called mosquitoes. And the particular species that I killed last night on my laptop here in Philadelphia is the tiger mosquito introduced from Egypt, which is the one who carries Zika and Chikungunya and variety and dengue and other New World viral diseases now, which comes actually from Egypt, and that's one of our invading disease carriers that we are dealing with at the present time, and that's the one that I got last night here in the kitchen. Okay, so we'll stop there.